The good news is that Tudor history offers some of the juiciest royal scandals ever recorded. The bad news is that history books tend to sanitize the truly disgusting parts, like how Henry VIII literally decomposed while still breathing. You think your Monday mornings are rough? Try waking up to the smell of your own festering leg ulcers, knowing you've still got to behead a wife or two before lunch. Henry's story isn't just about 6 wives and a church tantrum. It's about a Renaissance rock star who transformed from athletic heartthrob to human bioweapon whose stench could clear a room faster than modern crowd control measures. And while most kings are remembered for their conquests, Henry achieved the unique distinction of becoming his own mobile ecosystem, complete with maggots and a medical team that basically shrugged and said, "Have you tried essential oils?" When young Henry ascended to the throne in 1509, he was the medieval equivalent of a boy band frontman. Tall, athletic, with flaming red hair and thighs that could crush walnuts. The ladies swooned, the men envied, and nobody suspected this dreamboat would eventually require special engineering just to move his rotting carcass from bed to throne. The original royal influencer, Henry had a 32-inch waist and spent his mornings jousting, hawking, and composing music like some kind of Tudor-era Instagram husband. Fast forward a few decades, and this Renaissance Ryan Gosling had transformed into a 54-inch waisted monster whose personal physicians invented new medical terminology just to describe the various aromas emanating from beneath his royal robes. Talk about a glow down. Imagine if Chris Hemsworth gradually morphed into a human-sized wheel of forgotten cheese. That's essentially Henry's life trajectory. What historians often gloss over is that Henry's famous temper tantrum with the Catholic Church. You know, the whole, "I'm starting my own religion with blackjack and divorce" situation coincided suspiciously with his physical decline. Nothing says, "I'm totally fine with aging," quite like destroying centuries of religious tradition because your first wife couldn't produce a male heir and your mistress looked better in a corset. The timing suggests that perhaps the king's increasing irritability had less to do with theological differences and more to do with the fact that his once legendary legs were now developing suppurating wounds that refused to heal. If you've ever been hangry, imagine that feeling, but it's caused by your body literally consuming itself from the inside out. That's Henry by 1536, a walking cautionary tale against ghosting your personal trainer. By the time Henry hit middle age, his daily regimen had shifted dramatically from jousting champion extraordinaire to "how many servants does it take to roll me over so my sores don't fuse to the bedsheets?" The king who once impressed foreign ambassadors with his vigor now impressed them with his ability to consume 5,000 calories daily while simultaneously exuding fluids from various unmentionable orifices. Court physicians, using the cutting-edge medical knowledge of the time, which was roughly equivalent to today's Facebook health advice groups, prescribed such scientific treatments as applying live pigeons to the sores, and maybe try wearing different hats? Spoiler alert, neither worked particularly well. The royal medical team, presumably while backing slowly toward the nearest exit, assured Henry that his condition was perfectly normal for someone who had essentially transformed from human to sedentary meat balloon in under 2 decades. What medical condition actually plagued Henry? Modern historians have suggested everything from diabetes to syphilis, but the truth is likely a combo platter of ailments that turned the king into a Renaissance petri dish. In 1536, Henry suffered a jousting accident that reopened old leg wounds, which then refused to heal because, surprise, the king's immune system was about as effective as airport security. His ulcerated legs began to smell like a fish market during a summer power outage, and yet somehow he still managed to convince 2 more women to marry him. Talk about royal privilege. Imagine the dating profile: 53-year-old monarch, slightly used, comes with kingdom, 6 previous marriages, don't ask, and wounds that have their own weather systems. No gold diggers or Catholics, please. The king's declining health created logistical challenges that would baffle modern event planners. How exactly does one transport a malodorous monarch weighing north of 400 pounds between palaces without modern suspension systems? The answer: very carefully, and with a lot of rose water strategically placed around the royal procession. Court documents describe special mechanical devices, the 16th century equivalent of a forklift, designed specifically to hoist the king onto his horse or carry him upstairs. The mental image of dozens of straining servants attempting to maneuver Henry's gargantuan frame through narrow Tudor doorways without touching any of his sensitive wounds resembles some sort of macabre Renaissance version of the game Operation. One wrong move and instead of a buzzing noise you'd get beheaded. While Henry's physical deterioration was spectacular, his psychological transformation was equally alarming. The once charming prince became increasingly paranoid, volatile, and prone to executing anyone who looked at him sideways. Was this the result of chronic pain turning him into history's grumpiest monarch, or was something else happening in the royal cranium? Some historians suggest Henry suffered from repeated brain injuries from his jousting days, effectively giving him the Tudor equivalent of football player CTE. Others point to the psychological impact of living with chronic illness in an era when medical privacy meant your servants only gossiped about your pustulant sores after you left the room. Either way, the palace staff developed a highly sophisticated early warning system for detecting the king's moods that boiled down to, if he's ordering a scaffold built, update your resume. Perhaps the most ironic aspect of Henry's decay was how it contrasted with his carefully cultivated public image. Court painters were essentially the Photoshop experts of their day, instructed to portray the king as a powerful, imposing figure rather than the medical catastrophe he'd become. Hans Holbein's famous portrait shows Henry standing with legs apart in a power pose that screams masculine dominance, conveniently hiding the fact that standing unassisted had become as challenging for Henry as explaining cryptocurrency is for most of us today. The king who obsessed over his public persona was living in an increasingly uncooperative body, wearing specially designed codpieces to suggest virility while servants downwind were quietly passing out from the miasma of his festering flesh. Talk about fake news, Tudor style. The royal kitchens fueled Henry's deterioration with a diet that would make modern nutritionists spontaneously combust. Daily menus featured up to 13 courses of heavily spiced meats, sugary custards, and enough wine to float a small navy, with vegetables making only cameo appearances, usually buried under sauces or pastry. Henry consumed an estimated 5,000 calories daily, mostly in the form of protein and alcohol, creating the perfect storm for gout, diabetes, and hypertension. Modern doctors reviewing his case have suggested that Henry essentially had metabolic syndrome before it had a name, speedrunning his way through every lifestyle disease centuries before lifestyle diseases were a concept. His favorite meal reportedly included a dozen larks, because nothing says reasonable portion size quite like consuming an entire flock of songbirds before moving on to the main course. Court records detail increasingly desperate attempts to manage the king's condition as royal physicians through the entire medieval pharmacopoeia at his suppurating legs. Treatments included poultices made from exotic herbs, pulverized gemstones, because nothing heals wounds like rubbing them with ground-up diamonds, and various animal parts applied directly to the affected areas. One physician reportedly suggested wrapping the royal legs in whale placenta, a treatment that raises several questions, not least of which is the logistics of whale placenta procurement in 16th century England. These medical misadventures occurred while Henry continued his hobby of rewriting religious doctrine, proving that nothing helps you connect with your spirituality quite like having your infected extremities wrapped in the reproductive byproducts of marine mammals while your physicians argue about your humoral balance. By 1546, a year before his death, Henry had become so immobile that specially designed contraptions were required to move him between rooms. Contemporary accounts describe a system of ropes, pulleys, and what were essentially Renaissance forklifts operated by teams of the bulliest servants available. The king who once prided himself on athletic prowess now required an engineering team just to shift positions in bed. Yet even as his body betrayed him, Henry maintained his iron grip on power, a testament either to his remarkable force of will or to the fact that Tudor England lacked adequate disability discrimination laws. In a perverse way, Henry's physical deterioration might have made him more terrifying to courtiers. Nothing says unpredictable tyrant quite like a man in constant pain who controls an executioner on speed dial and can't remember if he's already ordered you beheaded or just thought about it during last night's fever dream. Claude, I'll continue with Chapter 2 of The Bizarre Case of Henry VIII, the Bad King Who Rotted Alive. Remember, this is a direct continuation of the narrative following your specifications. The court's attempts to manage Henry's increasingly pungent presence became something of a Renaissance-era air quality management crisis. Servants were assigned the unenviable task of constantly refreshing the king's chambers with herbs, incense, and perfumes, essentially creating the world's first Febreze protocol 4 centuries early. The royal perfumer, a position that suddenly became as crucial as Secretary of State, worked overtime concocting ever stronger scents to combat what one diplomatic visitor diplomatically referred to as His Majesty's most unique personal atmosphere. Imagine working as the royal smell guy, knowing your job performance was measured by how effectively you could mask the odor of decomposing royal flesh. Talk about workplace pressure. One nostril twitch from the wrong ambassador could end your career or possibly your life. Meanwhile, the king's personal attendants developed the 16th century equivalent of hazmat procedures, holding their breath while changing dressings and likely fighting over who got to open windows afterward. Henry's wardrobe underwent significant modifications to accommodate his expanding girth and leaking extremities. Royal tailors, who probably deserved combat pay, designed increasingly elaborate outfits with hidden panels, strategic padding, and special compartments for what court documents delicately called medicinal necessities, essentially 16th-century adult diapers. His once fashionable codpiece, previously a symbol of virility, had morphed into what was essentially a decorative awning over a medical disaster zone. Imagine the briefing. Your Majesty, we've redesigned your ceremonial robes to include 17 concealed absorbent pads and a built-in drainage system. The Spanish ambassador will never suspect. Fashion historians note that Henry pioneered what might be called distraction couture, clothing so ornate and jewel-encrusted that nobody would notice the king was essentially being wheeled around in a decorated compost bin. The culinary demands of feeding the deteriorating king created logistical nightmares for the royal kitchens. As Henry's condition worsened, his appetite remained remarkably robust, perhaps the only system in his body still functioning at peak performance. Court records show that royal banquets continued unabated, with the king consuming quantities of food that would stagger modern competitive eaters. One particularly impressive feast featured 30 different meat dishes, including such dietary highlights as porpoise in broth and peacock redressed in its skin, because nothing aids digestion quite like staring into the glazed eyes of a reconstructed bird while consuming its flesh. Meanwhile, royal physicians stood by helplessly, the Tudor equivalent of nutritionists watching a client order the entire left side of the Cheesecake Factory menu while claiming to be cutting back. The king's medical team expanded proportionally with his waistline, eventually including specialists whose job titles read like rejected medieval fantasy characters. The royal wound cleaner, master of the stool, yes, that was a real position, and yes, it involved exactly what you think, and various chirurgeons whose primary qualification appears to have been a strong stomach. These unfortunate souls formed a medical brain trust that combined the diagnostic precision of a magic 8-ball with treatment protocols seemingly designed by throwing darts at a board labeled with random substances. The king's leg continues to suppurate. Have we tried? Throws dart, powdered unicorn horn mixed with throws another dart, mercury and final dart, crushed pearls. Remarkably, none of these treatments proved effective, shocking absolutely no one with even a rudimentary understanding of human physiology. Perhaps the most tragicomic aspect of Henry's decline was his continued insistence on projecting virility and power even as his body systematically betrayed him. Court records describe elaborate hunting expeditions where the king, no longer able to mount a horse unassisted, would be strategically positioned at designated hunting stations, while courtiers drove terrified animals directly toward his stationary position. Imagine the pep talk to the hunting dogs. Remember, no matter how the prey zigzags, make sure it runs directly past the large immobile object smelling of medicinal ointments and disappointment. These carefully choreographed displays fooled precisely no one, yet the elaborate charade continued, with courtiers enthusiastically praising the king's remarkable aim and hunting prowess, while servants stood by with smelling salts for anyone downwind of the royal presence. The king's marital adventures continued despite, or perhaps because of, his deteriorating condition, leading to some awkward royal wedding nights. Catherine Parr, his sixth and final wife, has gone down in history as a nurturing caregiver who survived the king by outliving him. Modern historians, however, suggest her primary qualification was an iron constitution and perhaps anosmia, the inability to smell. Contemporary accounts describe Catherine reading religious texts aloud to the king, which may have been less about spiritual edification and more about having a legitimate reason to maintain a safe distance while still technically fulfilling her wifely duties. Imagine the royal marriage counseling sessions. Have you tried focusing on his personality? Yes, but his personality also has gangrene. The psychological impact of Henry's physical deterioration created a feedback loop of paranoia and rage that made the Tudor court resemble a Renaissance version of Survivor, where elimination meant literal elimination. As the king's mobility decreased, his suspicion of others increased proportionally, leading to execution orders being handed out with the casual frequency of business cards at a networking event. One can imagine the orientation for new courtiers. Welcome to Hampton Court. Here's your schedule, your chamber assignment, and a template for your last will and testament. We find it saves time to have these prepared in advance. The art of surviving Henry's court late in his reign required the diplomatic skills of a UN negotiator combined with the self-preservation instincts of a cockroach, plus the ability to convincingly compliment the royal appearance while breathing exclusively through your mouth. The king's once legendary mental acuity began to match his physical decline, resulting in policy decisions that swung wildly between micromanagement and complete disengagement. One day Henry might spend hours obsessing over minute details of religious doctrine. The next he'd be too consumed by pain to approve essential state papers. This governmental inconsistency created a sort of royal schizophrenia where courtiers never knew which Henry they'd encounter: the sharp-minded tyrant or the medication-addled monarch who might not remember their name or why he had ordered their arrest the previous day. Imagine trying to govern a kingdom under these conditions, like working for a boss who alternates between Steve Jobs-level perfectionism and falling asleep during critical meetings, except your performance review might involve an executioner. The king's personal library offers insights into his desperate search for relief, containing numerous medical texts with passages about leg ailments heavily annotated in the royal hand. One particularly poignant note in the margins reads, "Try mixture of crushed rubies and boar's blood," suggesting either genuine medical curiosity or the ravings of a man whose pain management plan had reached the throw exotic substances at the problems stage. Henry, who prided himself on his intellectual prowess, became a 16th-century version of a WebMD hypochondriac, self-diagnosing and demanding increasingly bizarre treatments. Court physicians, caught between their medical training, such as it was, and the desire to keep their heads attached to their shoulders, developed the art of appearing to follow the king's medical directives while subtly steering him toward less lethal interventions, essentially making them the original practitioners of the placebo nod. The logistics of transporting the increasingly immobile monarch between palaces became a military-scale operation requiring advanced planning worthy of the D-Day invasion. Royal engineers designed a special chair, essentially a 16th-century wheelchair, that required a team of strong men to operate. Progress through the English countryside occurred at roughly the pace of modern rush-hour traffic, with the royal procession moving at what courtiers euphemistically called a dignified pace, but what was essentially slower than most garden snails. Villages along the route received advance notice to prepare for the king's arrival, which involved not just the usual cleaning and decorating but also strategic placement of fragrant flowers and herbs to create olfactory buffer zones. One can imagine village elders briefing residents. "His Majesty will pass through tomorrow. Burn all the lavender we have, and whatever you do, don't inhale sharply or comment on any unusual odors if you value your head." Court records detail increasingly elaborate entertainment designed to distract the king from his constant pain, the Tudor equivalent of jingling keys in front of a cranky baby, except the baby weighs 400 pounds and can order executions. Musicians played constantly during meals, jesters performed increasingly desperate routines, and courtiers staged elaborate masks where the king could participate without moving more than absolutely necessary. Imagine being the court fool, knowing your job description has quietly shifted from amusing diversion to critical pain management technician, and that a failed joke might now be interpreted as deliberate treason. These entertainments served a dual purpose, occupying the king's attention and providing sufficient background noise to mask the groans, squelches, and occasional screams that accompanied any adjustment of the royal position. The court historian, presumably writing with one eye on posterity and the other on the executioner's axe, described these events as most pleasing to His Majesty, which ranks among history's greatest understatements. The king's declining mobility created architectural challenges that would baffle modern accessibility consultants. Hampton Court Palace, originally designed to showcase royal grandeur, underwent hasty renovations to accommodate a monarch who could barely navigate a doorway. Staircases, those villainous architectural features, became Henry's sworn enemies, requiring the installation of the world's first stair lifts, crude wooden platforms operated by sweating servants pulling on rope systems. Imagine the pitch meeting. "Your Majesty, we've designed a contraption that will allow you to ascend stairs with dignity, requiring only 15 of your strongest men and approximately 30 minutes per floor." Doorways were widened, ramps installed, and load-bearing floors reinforced, essentially creating Tudor-era ADA compliance years before anyone considered accessibility an architectural concern. The royal privy, a subject court chroniclers delicately avoided, required such significant modifications that it essentially became a small apartment, complete with its own staff of unfortunate souls whose job descriptions are best left to the imagination. The king's personal barge, once a symbol of royal pageantry on the Thames, underwent modifications that transformed it from elegant water vessel to floating medical facility. Special hoisting mechanisms were installed to lower the royal mass onto cushioned seating, while strategic canopies provided both shade and, more importantly, olfactory isolation from nearby vessels. River traffic would be halted for these royal processions, not merely out of respect but as a practical consideration. The weight created by the heavily laden royal barge threatened to swamp smaller craft. One contemporary account describes watermen crossing themselves as the king's vessel approached, though whether from royal reverence or in response to the cloud of medicinal aromas wafting across the water remains ambiguous. Imagine being a Thames boatman, instructed to maintain a respectful distance from the royal barge while also staying upwind if you valued your last meal remaining internal. The king's hunting parties transformed from dynamic sporting events to elaborately staged productions worthy of a Steven Spielberg set. Unable to chase prey through the underbrush, Henry would be positioned at strategic hunting stations, essentially medieval sniper nests, while hundreds of servants and beaters drove terrified wildlife toward the royal crossbow. Court records describe one such hunt where 60 deer were driven past the king's position, resulting in His Majesty's most excellent shooting of 3 fine bucks. A success rate that would embarrass even the most novice modern hunter. These events required military-level planning and coordination, with servants mapping routes, constructing comfortable viewing platforms, and establishing supply chains to keep the immobile monarch fed, medicated, and relatively odor-neutral throughout the day. Meanwhile, courtiers enthusiastically praised each royal shot as if witnessing Robin Hood himself, rather than a man essentially playing a rigged game of duck hunt with live animals. The royal bedroom became a medical ward that would make modern hospital administrators reach for smelling salts. Teams of physicians rotated through constant attendance, changing dressings, applying ointments, and debating treatments in hushed tones while the king alternated between pain-induced rage and medication-induced stupor. The royal bed itself, a structure that started as a symbol of monarchical splendor, evolved into a specialized medical device with strategically placed supports, cushions, and moisture-resistant barriers. Servants worked in shifts to adjust the king's position, a process that contemporary accounts compare to the moving of a great ship in dry dock, requiring careful planning, multiple strong backs, and the constant fear that something might catastrophically rupture. Imagine the performance review for the royal bed turner. Excellent technique on the quarter roll maneuver. However, please work on reducing His Majesty's screaming during the procedure. Court fashion underwent subtle modifications as courtiers adapted to the king's condition. Heavy perfumes became mandatory rather than optional, with contemporary accounts describing nobles competing to discover scents that could effectively combat the royal atmosphere without triggering Henry's increasingly frequent headaches. Handkerchiefs soaked in aromatic oils became fashionable accessories, ostensibly for show but practically for emergency breathing apparatus. The strategic positioning of courtiers during royal audiences developed into an elaborate dance, with the most favored or unfortunate, depending on one's perspective, required to stand closest to the throne while those lower in status maintained a respectful and breathable distance. One diplomat's private correspondence describes learning that his proximity to the king during meetings directly reflected his nation's standing. We of Spain are granted positions 3 yards distant, while the French must endure placement at arm's length, surely a sign of our greater favor, despite their insistence otherwise. The royal kitchens continued producing extraordinary feasts despite growing evidence that the king's diet was essentially fueling his own decomposition. Royal physicians occasionally attempted dietary interventions, only to be overruled by a monarch who considered culinary restriction a greater affront than the treason. One brave doctor reportedly suggested reducing wine consumption, only to find himself assigned to border duty in Scotland the following day. The king's daily menu remained a cardiologist's nightmare. Multiple roasted meats, game pies heavy with suet, sugared fruits, and enough alcohol to preserve the royal organs while the rest of him deteriorated. Imagine being the royal food taster, traditionally a position concerned with detecting poison but now equally focused on determining whether each dish would trigger another gout flare-up or merely contribute to the ongoing medical catastrophe. Court records note one feast where Henry consumed 2 entire peacocks, a swan, and a quarter of venison before moving on to dessert. Performance worthy of a competitive eating champion, albeit one whose digestive rebellion was treated as a matter of state security. The king's temper, never particularly mild to begin with, reached legendary volatility as his physical discomfort increased. Courtiers developed an elaborate early warning system to detect royal mood shifts, with coded phrases and signals passing through the court faster than palace gossip. The lion wakes with thunder might indicate that Henry had experienced a particularly painful night and should not be approached with anything but good news. Sunshine on the throne suggested a rare moment of royal comfort when difficult matters might be raised without risking immediate execution. Imagine the court equivalent of a weather report. Expect heavy storms around midday audience, clearing briefly during the evening meal, with a 70% chance of random beheadings by nightfall. New courtiers received surreptitious coaching on recognizing the subtle facial cues that differentiated momentarily displeased but recoverable from start drafting your will immediately. Religious ceremonies, which Henry continued to attend with regal determination, required elaborate preparation worthy of moving a space shuttle. The king, still head of the Church of England despite increasingly resembling its least heavenly aspects, insisted on maintaining visible piety even as mobility became nearly impossible. Special platforms were constructed in royal chapels, allowing the king to be wheeled into position and giving the optical illusion of standing during services when in fact he was being supported by an elaborate hidden framework. Communion presented particular challenges as tradition required the monarch to kneel, a position Henry's knees had abandoned years earlier. Court records describe a specially designed kneeler with a mechanical assistance system operated by hidden servants that could create the appearance of religious genuflection without requiring actual joint movement. Imagine the chapel briefing. On the third bell, lower His Majesty exactly 7 inches, hold for 10 seconds, then raise on my signal, and for God's sake, secure the wound dressings first this time. The management of royal waste, both bodily and medical, became a logistical operation that would challenge modern hazardous materials teams. Special crews were assigned to the discreet removal and disposal of used dressings, soiled linens, and other unmentionable byproducts of the king's condition. These materials couldn't simply be discarded with ordinary refuse. Anything that had touched the royal body was technically property of the crown and required proper ceremonial disposal to prevent witchcraft, treason, or worst of all, gossip. Imagine the job description: seeking discreet individual for handling of royal medical waste. Strong stomach required, sense of smell optional. Previous experience in plague cleanup preferred. Ability to maintain state secrets essential. Competitive hazard pay offered for successful candidates who survive probationary period. The king's legacy planning took on increasing urgency as his condition worsened, creating a paradoxical situation where Henry simultaneously refused to acknowledge his mortality while obsessively planning for it. Royal artists were commissioned to create posthumous images showing the king in his prime rather than his current state, the Tudor equivalent of selecting your most flattering profile picture to be displayed at your funeral. Legal documents were drafted and redrafted as Henry's favor shifted between courtiers, creating a paperwork tsunami that kept royal scribes working through the night. Meanwhile, the king's temper flared at any suggestion that arrangements might be necessary, leading to the peculiar spectacle of an entire court planning for an event they could never directly mention. Imagine the verbal gymnastics required. Your Majesty, regarding the purely hypothetical and certainly not imminent circumstance in which the kingdom might theoretically continue under your son's guidance, perhaps we might consider documenting your current wishes? Not that such documentation would be needed for decades, of course. As 1546 progressed, the king's lucid periods became increasingly rare, creating a power vacuum that ambitious courtiers rushed to fill. Factions formed around potential regents for the young Prince Edward, with Thomas Seymour and Edward Seymour positioning themselves as uncles to the future king while the Duke of Norfolk attempted to secure Howard family influence. These political maneuvers occurred literally over the decaying body of a monarch who remained technically in power but was increasingly detached from daily governance. The Privy Council developed elaborate procedures for obtaining royal approval on documents during brief periods of clarity, creating a sort of time management system for monarchy that prioritized state business based on urgency and the king's pain levels. Imagine the scheduling challenge. His Majesty typically experiences 20 minutes of lucidity following his morning medications. We'll present the French treaty then, followed by the Scottish border dispatch if he remains conscious, saving the tax collection warrants for tomorrow's window. The king's final winter was marked by increasingly desperate medical interventions that read like a medieval version of Fear Factor. As conventional treatments failed, royal physicians turned to more exotic options, including a poultice made from live puppies, yes actually, that were sliced open and applied directly to the king's suppurating legs. The theory, such as it was, suggested that the vital energy of the puppies would somehow transfer to the dying tissues. A treatment that managed to be simultaneously heartbreaking, disgusting, and completely ineffective. Other last-ditch efforts included mercury treatments, slowly poisoning the king while claiming to cure him, powdered gemstone concoctions, literally drinking money, and various magical incantations that physicians pretended were Latin medical terminology. Imagine the Royal Medical Conference. Gentlemen, conventional medicine has failed. It's time to implement protocol desperation. Bring in the puppies, the wizard, and that guy who claims to have learned medicine from aliens. Court astrologers gained unprecedented influence as conventional medicine failed, providing star-based explanations for the king's deterioration that conveniently absolved everyone of responsibility. Mercury is in retrograde, Your Majesty, which explains both your leg pain and why the French ambassador looked at you funny. These celestial consultants crafted elaborate horoscopes predicting imminent improvement, carefully scheduled royal activities to align with favorable star positions, and generally provided comforting nonsense at a time when comfort of any kind was in short supply. The royal physicians, their medical credibility in tatters, began incorporating astrological timing into treatment plans, creating the world's first interdisciplinary care team of doctors and fortune tellers. Imagine the treatment schedule: apply the leech poultice at moonrise, administer the herbal tincture when Venus appears, and under no circumstances change the dressings while Saturn is visible, as everyone knows Saturn rules festering wounds and gets very cranky about bandage changes. The king's rare public appearances during his final months required theatrical production values that would make Broadway producers weep. Teams of servants would prepare for days, establishing routes, building ramps, and creating elaborate pulley systems to move the royal mass with minimal jostling, and thus minimal screaming. Specially designed concealment screens were positioned throughout the route, allowing emergency medical interventions without public visibility. The king would be dressed hours in advance, layer upon layer of ornate clothing strategically positioned to hide medical appliances and drainage systems. One contemporary account describes a particularly ambitious Christmas court appearance that required 37 people working in coordinated teams, essentially creating a Tudor-era version of those Chinese parade dragons, except instead of a mythical creature, they were animating a half-dead monarch. Imagine the stage directions. On the count of 3, lift simultaneously. Process forward 7 paces. Pause for cheering. If His Majesty begins leaking, deploy the emergency diversion gestures immediately. The psychological impact of managing a deteriorating king created a court-wide trauma response that would keep modern therapists employed for decades. Courtiers developed elaborate coping mechanisms to deal with the constant stress of serving a volatile, pain-ridden monarch whose mood could shift from benevolence to homicidal rage faster than a TikTok trend. Gallows humor became the primary psychological release valve, though only among absolutely trusted companions and well away from royal earshot. Private diaries from the period describe courtiers experiencing nightmares, stress-induced illnesses, and what modern psychologists would recognize as clear PTSD symptoms. Imagine the support group. Hi, I'm Lord Chamberlain, and it's been 3 days since I last had to pretend the king's leg smells like roses while helping relocate a wound dressing that had fused to the royal bedsheets. Progress. The collective trauma created bizarre palace rituals, including what one diary describes as the cleansing breath, a moment when exiting the royal chambers when courtiers would exhale dramatically, physically expelling the experience before composing themselves to re-enter the world. The royal finances strained under the weight of maintaining a medical-industrial complex devoted entirely to one failing body. Special foods imported from across Europe, exotic treatment ingredients, powdered unicorn horn didn't come cheap, even if it was actually just ground-up narwhal tusk, and the small army of medical personnel required constant funding at a time when Henry's military adventures had already depleted the treasury. Palace accountants developed creative bookkeeping worthy of modern corporate tax evaders, hiding medical expenses under categories like royal ceremonial and diplomatic necessities. Meanwhile, taxation increased to support what was essentially the world's most expensive hospice care, creating murmurs of discontent among the population. Imagine the budget meeting. If we reclassify the wound specialists as religious advisors, move the apothecary expenses under kitchen supplies, and sell another monastery, we can afford the Egyptian healing mud for approximately 3 more weeks. After that, we may need to invade France again, purely for medicinal funding purposes, of course. Henry's intellectual engagement with statecraft increasingly resembled a game of governmental telephone, with policies emerging from the royal bedroom in forms barely recognizable from their original intent. The king, oscillating between pain-induced clarity and medication-induced confusion, would issue proclamations that required careful interpretation by long-serving advisors familiar with separating actual royal will from painkiller-inspired tangents. His Majesty has ordered the immediate execution of all red-headed women over 40, might be translated to, the king had a bad night and his ex-wife visited in a nightmare. This created a shadow government of interpreters who essentially ran the country while maintaining the fiction of direct royal control. Imagine the diplomatic challenge. explaining to foreign ambassadors that the king's declaration of war against Portugal was actually just a bad reaction to his new medication, without implying that anyone other than Henry was making decisions. The royal children's visits to their deteriorating father became carefully choreographed performances designed to maintain the illusion of monarchical vigor while minimizing psychological trauma to the future rulers of England. Prince Edward, Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth would be briefed extensively before each encounter, with strict guidelines on acceptable topics: recent hunting successes. Yes. French diplomatic relations. Yes. Why Daddy smells like a battlefield morgue? Absolutely not. The royal apartments would undergo extreme cleaning operations before these visits, with fresh rushes, burning incense and strategic furniture placement creating paths that kept the children at optimal distances, close enough for convincing interaction but far enough to prevent olfactory distress. These encounters typically lasted precisely as long as the king could maintain coherence and continence, with royal handlers developing elaborate signals to indicate when immediate extraction was required. Imagine the briefing: Princess Elizabeth, when Lord Hertford tugs his left earlobe, you are to immediately remember an urgent astronomy lesson, curtsy, and back away without breaking eye contact or, under any circumstances, wrinkling your nose. The management of royal pain led to increasingly exotic pharmaceutical explorations that would raise eyebrows even in modern Colorado dispensaries. Court physicians, desperate for effective analgesics, imported opium preparations from Ottoman territories, experimented with fermented beverages laced with various fungi, and created tinctures containing everything from cannabis to crushed beetle shells. The resulting medication regimen created periods where the king experienced either excruciating pain or floated in a hallucinogenic haze where he reportedly conversed with his deceased wives, negotiated with foreign dignitaries not present in the room, and issued contradictory orders that sent the court into diplomatic tailspins. Imagine being the royal physician responsible for dosage, miscalculate in one direction and face a screaming monarch demanding your immediate execution, err in the other and deal with a drooling sovereign insisting that his favorite hunting dog be appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. Court records describe an incident where an over-medicated Henry solemnly knighted a particularly impressive roast pheasant during a state dinner, creating an awkward moment where courtiers debated whether to acknowledge Sir Drumstick or politely ignore the ceremony. Foreign diplomats stationed at the English court found themselves in an increasingly surreal situation, reporting back to their governments about a king who was simultaneously alive, dead, in charge and incapacitated. These reports required linguistic gymnastics worthy of modern political spin doctors, as ambassadors attempted to accurately convey England's unstable leadership situation without committing the career-ending, and potentially life-ending, faux pas of suggesting Henry was anything less than completely in command. Spanish, French, and imperial dispatches from this period are masterpieces of diplomatic ambiguity, filled with phrases like His Majesty, displaying his characteristic vigor despite temporary physical inconveniences, and the king, whose bodily humors are somewhat imbalanced yet whose mental acuity remains terrifyingly intact. Imagine the coded messages: the lion sleeps but one eye remains open. Translation: he's drugged into oblivion most days but occasionally wakes up and executes someone randomly, so we're all still walking on eggshells. The physical decline of the king created a bizarre situation where Henry's body became the ultimate state secret, simultaneously the most discussed and most forbidden topic at court. Elaborate information hierarchies developed regarding who could know what about the royal condition. The innermost circle, those who directly assisted with medical care, were bound by oaths that made modern medical privacy laws look like casual suggestions. The next layer received sanitized briefings about general health status but no specific details. The court at large operated on rumor and observation, while the general public received propaganda depicting a vigorous king temporarily indisposed with minor ailments. This information compartmentalization created a court where everyone was simultaneously lying to and being lied to about the same subject, depending on their position in the hierarchy. Imagine the conversational contortions. Lord Norfolk, having been granted the Level 3 Royal Health Briefing, is permitted to know about the leg ulcers but not their severity or odor. He may discuss them only with others possessing Level 3 clearance or above, and only in designated secure locations after performing the secret handshake and whispered password. The final months of 1546 saw the emergence of what modern corporate consultants would recognize as succession planning, albeit with significantly higher stakes than the average CEO transition. As Henry's periods of lucidity decreased, powerful court factions maneuvered to position themselves advantageously for the imminent regency of young Edward. The Seymour brothers, Edward and Thomas, uncles to the future king, consolidated control over the prince's household and military positions. The conservative religious faction led by Norfolk and Gardiner pushed for last-minute returns to Catholic traditions, while reformists like Cranmer worked to secure Protestant advances. These political maneuvers occurred in whispers behind tapestries, in coded correspondence, and during hunting expeditions conveniently scheduled when the king was experiencing his resting periods, court euphemism for too drugged to function. Imagine the strategic planning. If we can secure signatures on these 5 documents during tomorrow's morning lucidity window, control the information flow during the afternoon delirium phase, and prevent Norfolk from accessing His Majesty during the evening pain crisis, we can effectively guarantee Protestant dominance for the first 3 years of Edward's reign. As January 1547 arrived, the king's condition deteriorated from walking medical catastrophe to, how is he still breathing? The royal physicians, having exhausted conventional treatments, unconventional treatments, and treatments that were essentially random combinations of household objects and exotic animal parts, adopted a strategy best described as comfort measures only, with occasional experimental horror. Court records describe increasingly desperate attempts to manage pain, including what appears to have been primitive bloodletting combined with early hydrotherapy, essentially creating the world's first royal hot tub filled with leeches. The king, drifting between consciousness and merciful oblivion, continued issuing sporadic and sometimes contradictory orders that were carefully interpreted by whichever faction had access during moments of clarity. Imagine the physician's daily log. January 3rd. His Majesty consumed 3 bites of peacock before vomiting. Applied poultice of crushed sapphires mixed with unicorn horn, elk antler, to both legs. Patient became agitated, ordered execution of physician, then forgot incident and requested minstrels. Pain level, 17 out of 10. Prognosis, how is this man not dead already? The court's elaborate charade of normalcy reached performance art levels as the king's death visibly approached. Official communications continued to describe Henry as temporarily indisposed and resting comfortably, while ambassadorial dispatches smuggled out in diplomatic pouches told drastically different stories. One French report described the king as more corpse than monarch, animated primarily by spite and strong medication. Court life maintained its scheduled rhythm of feasts, entertainments, and ceremonial functions, creating a surreal parallel reality where everyone pretended the kingdom wasn't essentially operating on autopilot while the pilot decomposed in the cockpit. The most challenging performances fell to those courtiers who had recently seen the king's actual condition and then had to appear at public functions enthusiastically describing His Majesty's improving health and eagerness to rejoin court activities any day now. Imagine the acting challenge, maintaining a straight face while assuring visiting dignitaries that the king, whose left leg now required its own dedicated medical team, was simply taking additional rest before returning to his favorite pastimes of vigorous hunting and dynamic dancing. The theological implications of Henry's condition created existential crises for a man who had remade England's religious landscape to suit his personal needs. As death approached, the king reportedly oscillated between Protestant simplicity and Catholic ritual, hedging his spiritual bets while courtiers from both religious factions jockeyed for influence over his final declarations. Whispered confessions, hastily performed rites, and theological debates took place around the royal deathbed, sometimes simultaneously and occasionally while the subject of these ministrations was neither fully conscious nor particularly coherent. Archbishop Cranmer, summoned for final confessions, reportedly found himself competing with Catholic-leaning courtiers who had smuggled in alternative religious advisors through servant passages. Imagine the scene: a dying king surrounded by representatives of competing religions, each attempting to secure his soul for their theological team like spiritual talent scouts, while Henry himself, the man who had created his own church primarily to facilitate a divorce, drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally interrupting with requests for more wine and confused inquiries about which wife was currently in attendance. The logistical challenge of moving the dying king between palaces for his final Christmas court at Whitehall in December 1546 required engineering solutions worthy of modern disaster response teams. Special barges were constructed with reinforced platforms, innovative suspension systems, and privacy screens that served the dual purpose of maintaining royal dignity and containing royal odors. The journey from Greenwich to Whitehall, normally a pleasant river excursion of a few hours, became a full-day operation involving dozens of vessels, hundreds of attendants, and enough medical supplies to stock a field hospital. Contemporary accounts describe river traffic coming to a complete standstill as the royal flotilla passed, with observers on the banks crossing themselves, whether in reverence or horror remains unclear. Imagine the project management. We'll need 3 support barges for medical personnel, 2 for supplies, 4 for the mechanical lift system, and 1 just for the scented candles. The king's barge must maintain precisely 4 knots to minimize jostling, and we'll need weather contingencies for rain, excessive sun, or any waterfowl that might startle His Majesty by looking at him judgmentally. The Christmas Court of 1546, Henry's last public performance, was a masterpiece of royal theatre that would make modern special effects teams weep with admiration. The king, now barely able to remain conscious for more than short periods, was displayed in carefully choreographed tableaus designed to suggest vitality while requiring minimal actual movement. Positioned on a specially constructed throne that was essentially a decorated medical bed, Henry would be wheeled into position before audiences were admitted, then remain static while courtiers created the illusion of dynamic royal engagement through carefully staged interactions. One account describes a particularly ambitious Christmas feast where servants hidden beneath the royal dais would periodically jostle the king's platform when cues indicated he should react to court entertainment, essentially creating a royal marionette show. The illusion apparently worked well enough from a distance, though diplomatic reports note that more observant guests noticed that His Majesty maintained precisely the same expression and posture for uncomfortably extended periods, occasionally appearing to cease breathing entirely until discreetly prompted by the Earl of Hertford. As January progressed, the king turned his fading attention to final acts of pettiness disguised as statecraft. Henry's last will and testament underwent multiple revisions, with the king settling scores from his deathbed by elevating or eliminating courtiers seemingly at random. The Duke of Norfolk, scheduled for execution on January 28, was saved only by Henry's death the night before, a timing that suggests either divine intervention or simply that the universe occasionally has a sense of irony. The royal signature on final documents had deteriorated from the bold, confident hand of earlier years to a shaky mark reportedly guided by courtiers who physically moved the royal hand across parchment, creating questions about the legitimacy of final orders that would spark legal debates for years. Imagine the deathbed scene. Your Majesty, if you could just make your mark here to disinherit the Howards, here to execute Norfolk, and here to confirm that your son's Regency Council should exclude Catholics, French sympathizers, and anyone who ever mentioned your weight gain within your hearing during the past decade. The management of information about the king's decline became increasingly difficult as January 1547 progressed, requiring elaborate security measures to prevent news of his imminent death from reaching foreign powers or domestic rivals prematurely. Palace access was restricted to essential personnel, with multiple checkpoints established to screen visitors. Couriers and messengers were detained on various pretexts to prevent unauthorized communications, while official dispatches continued describing a monarch who was recovering steadily, even as funeral arrangements were being quietly finalized. The Privy Council established what was essentially a 16th-century version of a secure communication protocol, with coded phrases and trusted messengers ready to inform key power centers the moment Henry actually died, information that needed to reach allies before enemies to prevent potential power vacuums. Imagine the security briefing. The phrase, "Winter has ended," will indicate the king's passing. This information is to be conveyed only via the approved messenger network, and anyone caught transmitting unauthorized reports will be considered guilty of treason. Until official notification, the king is to be referred to as resting comfortably regardless of actual status, up to and including rigor mortis. The final days of Henry's life saw increasing competition between court factions to control access to the dying king, creating what was essentially a Tudor version of a hospital visitation schedule if the patient could sign execution orders. The conservative Norfolk faction and reformist Seymour Cranmer alliance established an uneasy rotation system, each carefully monitoring the other's time with the king to prevent last-minute policy changes or unfavorable will adjustments. This arrangement led to the peculiar spectacle of powerful nobles literally timing each other's deathbed visits with hourglasses, while physicians caught in the middle attempted to provide care without appearing to favor either side. Court records describe increasingly tense exchanges as Henry's coherent periods became shorter and less predictable, creating a macabre race to secure royal approval for factional priorities before the final breath. Imagine the scheduling conflict. Lord Hertford, your faction had the king for 20 minutes after this morning's medication, which means the Norfolk alliance is entitled to equal time before the afternoon decline. If His Majesty becomes lucid during dinner, visitation rights alternate by course, with Protestants receiving soup through fish, and Catholics entitled to access during meat through dessert. On January 27, 1547, as death finally approached, The king reportedly experienced a moment of surprising clarity that unnerved attendants accustomed to his medicated haze. According to Sir Anthony Denny, who had drawn the unenviable task of informing Henry that he was actively dying, the king responded with unexpected lucidity, "It is true, therefore call the spiritual men to me." What followed was essentially speed dating for the royal soul, as religious advisors were hastily summoned to perform last rites. Archbishop Cranmer arrived last, by which time the king had reportedly lost the ability to speak. When asked for a sign that he placed his trust in Christ, Henry supposedly squeezed Cranmer's hand, an ambiguous gesture that both religious factions would later interpret as divine endorsement of their particular theology. Imagine being Cranmer, desperately trying to determine if a dying man's hand squeeze was a meaningful spiritual communication or simply a random muscle spasm, while knowing that the religious direction of an entire nation might hinge on your interpretation. The actual moment of Henry's death during the early hours of January 28, 1547, was kept secret for nearly 3 days, an impressive feat of information management in an age without secure communications. This delay allowed the Seymour faction to secure young Edward, position troops strategically, and generally prepare for a smooth transition before potential rivals could organize opposition. The king's body, which had been problematic enough while inhabited by Henry, now presented new challenges as royal physicians attempted preservation techniques that were essentially medieval embalming, a process that one account describes as requiring substantially more spices than the royal kitchens typically use in a year. The 100-day mourning period featured an elaborate funeral procession where Henry's lead-lined coffin reportedly broke through the temporary overnight shelter at Sion House, an incident that Protestants gleefully interpreted as divine judgment and Catholics discreetly failed to record in official accounts. Imagine the logistics meeting. The coffin weighs approximately the same as a small cottage. We'll need 30 pallbearers rotating in groups of 10 reinforced platforms at every resting point, and for God's sake, someone check the floor at Sion. We don't want a repeat of the Windsor incident where His Majesty nearly ended up in the basement. While the official historical record presents Henry's death with appropriate dignity, private diaries and diplomatic reports tell a different story. One of palace servants finally exhaling after years of walking on eggshells, physicians drinking themselves into temporary oblivion after weeks of impossible medical demands, and courtiers rapidly recalibrating lifetime survival strategies built around avoiding one man's wrath. The court transitioned with remarkable speed from absolute terror of Henry to careful management of Edward's regents, barely missing a beat while trading one form of political danger for another. Meanwhile, Henry's body proceeded to its final resting place in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, where it would later be joined by his favorite wife Jane Seymour and eventually Charles I, creating what must be history's most awkward posthumous roommate situation. The marble sarcophagus, originally commissioned by Cardinal Wolsey for himself, then appropriated by Henry after Wolsey's fall from grace, serves as a final ironic footnote. Even in death, Henry's arrangements involved taking something that belonged to someone else. For nearly 2 centuries, Henry's grave remained unmarked by anything more elaborate than a simple stone slab, a surprisingly modest end for a man who had lived with such outsized appetite for glory, wives, and caloric intake. The ornate tomb complex he had planned for himself never materialized as Edward's regents found more pressing uses for royal funds, creating a final cosmic punchline to a life defined by excess. It wasn't until the reign of William IV in the 19th century that a proper memorial identified the resting place of the man who had reshaped England through sheer force of will and an impressive talent for surviving what should have been fatal medical conditions years longer than reasonably expected. Visitors to Windsor today who view the simple marble marker might reflect on life's great equalizer. No matter how many monasteries you dissolve, wives you behead, or churches you create, eventually you're just another dead king with a less impressive monument than you'd planned, proving that in the great royal real estate market of eternity, location still matters more than square footage. As modern tourists wander through Hampton Court Palace taking selfies beside the famous portrait of Henry looking like a Renaissance linebacker, few realize they're admiring a 16th-century example of extreme Photoshop. Hans Holbein, who painted the most famous image of Henry at his most imposing, employed artistic techniques that would make modern Instagram influencers nod in appreciation. The powerful stance? Physically impossible given the king's actual mobility. The impressive calves? More aspirational than anatomical. The confident gaze? Captured during a rare pain-free moment between wound dressings. This image, carefully crafted state propaganda, has defined our collective mental picture of Henry for centuries, proving that history's first impressions are created not by reality but by whoever controls the portraiture commission. Modern historians examining Henry's actual medical records have concluded that the impressive figure in these paintings had more in common with Baron Harkonnen from Dune than the strapping monarch of popular imagination. Imagine the portrait sitting. Your Majesty, if you could just position yourself behind this conveniently placed table that hides everything below your elaborate doublet, maintain this expression of stern authority for approximately 3 seconds while I sketch, and perhaps we could add the muscular legs later from memory or imagination. The medical mystery of what actually killed Henry has generated centuries of posthumous diagnosis that would make Dr. House envious. Modern physicians reviewing the historical symptoms have proposed everything from type 2 diabetes to chronic osteomyelitis, Cushing syndrome to syphilis. The king's legendary appetite, combined with his declining mobility, certainly suggests metabolic syndrome complicated by obesity, essentially the same conditions filling modern medical practices, just without the convenience of electric mobility scooters or drive-through pharmacies. Some researchers have suggested that a jousting accident in 1536 marked the beginning of the end, creating a domino effect of declining health. Inability to exercise leading to weight gain, leading to diabetes, leading to poor wound healing, leading to chronic infection. All exacerbated by a medical team whose primary treatment tools were leeches, mercury, and optimistic thinking. Imagine a modern emergency room receiving Henry, male patient, 55, morbidly obese, presenting with bilateral leg ulcers, uncontrolled diabetes, hypertension, probable gout, and mood disturbances. Patient reports previous treatment with precious metals, ground unicorn horn, and puppy poultices. Current medications include whatever the court physician found in the woods yesterday, and wine, lots of wine. The psychological legacy of Henry's reign created what modern therapists would recognize as generational trauma throughout the Tudor court. Children raised in the atmosphere of unpredictable royal rage and sudden executions grew into adults with remarkable adaptability to changing political circumstances and finely tuned survival instincts. Elizabeth I, who witnessed her father's decline from a safe distance, developed her famous indecision and reluctance to marry at least partly from watching Henry cycle through wives with the casual frequency of a modern bachelor changing dating apps. Mary's religious zealotry reflected her desperate attempt to restore the certainties of her childhood before her father's great matter turned her world upside down. Even Edward VI, who barely knew his father, inherited a governing style marked by rigid control and religious certainty, psychological defenses against the chaos of the previous reign. Imagine the Tudor family therapy session. So Elizabeth, you're saying your commitment issues might be related to watching your father execute your mother and later seeing your stepmother shipped to the Tower? How does that make you feel? And Mary, could your need to burn Protestants be displaced anger about your father's treatment of your mother? Edward, please stop rewriting the prayer book during our session. The architectural legacy of Henry's medical decline remains visible in modern Britain, though few tourists realize their admiring 16th-century accessibility modifications. Hampton Court's famously wide doorways, now appreciated for their grand aesthetic, were originally expanded to accommodate a monarch who had outgrown standard Tudor dimensions. The Great Hall's impressive proportions were designed partly to ensure adequate ventilation during royal appearances when Henry's medical odors required significant air circulation. Even the palace gardens reflect adaptations to royal mobility issues, with wide, gently sloping paths replacing earlier step designs that had become navigational nightmares for the king and his entourage. Modern architectural historians have identified numerous subtle modifications throughout Henry's palaces that track his declining health, from the addition of ground-floor royal apartments to the strategic placement of privy chambers never more than a short waddle from major public rooms. Imagine the Tudor version of an ADA compliance inspection. The royal presence chamber now features reinforced flooring, grab rails disguised as decorative molding, and emergency exits wide enough for 8 grown men carrying one monarch in urgent need of medical attention. The culinary consequences of Henry's reign extended far beyond his personal meal plan, reshaping English eating habits for generations. The king's legendary appetite elevated certain dishes to fashionable status simply through royal preference, while his medical conditions inspired early versions of specialized diets that courtiers would adopt either from genuine health concerns or simple desire to emulate royalty. Tudor feasts, designed to showcase abundance to the point of waste, established eating patterns that would contribute to England's complicated relationship with food for centuries. Henry's courtiers, while publicly emulating the king's eating habits, privately began exploring moderation after witnessing the royal health decline, creating an early version of do as I say, not as I do dietary advice. Court physicians, attempting to manage the king's gout, developed primitive versions of low-purine diets that would eventually evolve into more scientific approaches. Imagine the Tudor equivalent of modern diet culture. Lord Suffolk has adopted the physician royal eating plan: no more than 3 types of meat per meal, wine diluted with water after the 4th cup, and purging limited to bi-weekly rather than after every feast. He's lost nearly a stone and hasn't developed any new gout flares this month. The fashion trends influenced by Henry's physical changes created ripple effects throughout Tudor society, as courtiers adjusted their wardrobes both to accommodate similar middle-aged spread and to avoid the appearance of mocking the royal silhouette. The king's famously padded doublets, originally designed to enhance an athletic frame but later necessary to create some semblance of structure around an increasingly amorphous torso, established silhouettes that would dominate men's fashion for decades. Even Henry's specially designed codpieces, which grew larger as the king himself became less able to perform the activities such accessories advertised, created a bigger is better approach to male fashion that prioritized appearance over function. Modern fashion historians have identified the Henry effect, in everything from padded shoulders to the strategic use of vertical elements to create the illusion of height, proof that status dressing remains consistent across centuries, even if the specific challenges change. Imagine the Tudor fashion influencer. This season's must-have look features doublets with subtle padding that creates a triangular silhouette, hose that suggest athletic calves while accommodating actual ones that haven't seen exercise since the previous reign, and codpieces sized proportionally to one's political ambitions rather than anatomical realities. The medical profession itself experienced significant evolution in response to the challenge of keeping Henry functioning, or at least technically alive, during his final years. The king's personal physicians, faced with a patient who combined the worst aspects of modern obesity, diabetes, and autoimmune conditions without any effective treatments, essentially created the framework for modern multidisciplinary care through desperate innovation. Specialized roles emerged as different aspects of the royal anatomy required dedicated attention. Wound care specialists, pain management experts, nutrition advisors, apparently entirely unsuccessful, and mobility consultants. While their treatments were ineffective by modern standards, the systematic approach to complex medical conditions pioneered during Henry's decline established precedents that would eventually evolve into modern medical specialization. Imagine the first Tudor Team Care Conference. Gentlemen, we face unprecedented challenges requiring coordinated efforts. Dr. Smith will focus on the left leg ulcerations. Dr. Jones will monitor the digestive disturbances. Brother Thomas will handle spiritual concerns resulting from the physical decline, and Lord Winchester will manage the diplomatic implications of the royal odor during foreign ambassador visits. May God have mercy on us all. The surprising feminist legacy of Henry's medical decline emerges from examining how his last wife, Catherine Parr, navigated the challenges of being married to a walking medical disaster. Catherine, often portrayed simply as the survivor who outlasted Henry, was actually pioneering a role that would become sadly familiar to many women: caregiver to a difficult, chronically ill spouse with more power than reasonable behavior. Her careful management of Henry's moods, medical treatments, and political decisions during his final years established her as essentially England's First Lady, a political partner who influenced policy through strategic support rather than direct authority. Catherine's ability to redirect Henry's more destructive impulses, manage his medical care, and simultaneously advance her own religious agenda while appearing to simply support her husband's wisdom represented a masterclass in working within oppressive systems. Imagine Catherine's diary entries. Today managed to prevent execution of 3 courtiers by suggesting their offenses be reconsidered after His Majesty's leg dressings, by which time he had forgotten his rage. Introduced Protestant prayer book disguised as new pain management technique. Convinced royal physicians that the king's plan to invade Scotland personally was medically inadvisable without directly mentioning that he cannot mount a horse without mechanical assistance. Must remember to burn this diary before retiring. The complex legacy of Henry's physical deterioration includes the surprising acceleration of English bureaucracy, necessity being the mother of governmental innovation. As the king became less capable of consistent decision-making, the mechanisms of state adapted to function with increasingly minimal royal input, creating administrative systems that could operate semi-autonomously while maintaining the fiction of direct monarchical control. The Privy Council developed standardized procedures for presenting information efficiently during the king's limited periods of clarity, essentially creating the executive summary centuries before business schools would teach the concept. Document design evolved to accommodate royal limitations, with important state papers featuring larger text, simplified language, and visual cues that could help a medication-addled monarch focus on key decision points. Imagine the Tudor briefing document guidelines. All treaties shall be summarized in no more than 1 page, with potential execution orders highlighted in red. Financial matters shall include no more than 3 numbers per document. French ambassador complaints shall be reworded to include at least 1 phrase that might prompt royal indignation and subsequent napping, allowing postponement of decisions until more favorable circumstances. The educational consequences of Henry's decline manifested most clearly in the medical training of Prince Edward's tutors, who received unprecedented instruction in recognizing hereditary conditions that might affect the royal heir. Court physicians, concerned that young Edward might have inherited his father's potential for physical decline, created what was essentially Tudor preventative medicine, a combination of dietary guidelines, exercise requirements, and health monitoring that would influence royal education for generations. Edward's famously rigorous academic schedule included regular physical activities specifically designed to prevent the sedentary habits that had contributed to his father's deterioration, while his meals were carefully balanced according to the nutritional understanding of the time, which was admittedly limited to less meat than his father, and occasional vegetables. This royal health curriculum created a template for aristocratic male education that would eventually filter down through society, establishing the connection between physical activity and health maintenance that would later become formalized in public school athletics. Imagine the Tudor royal tutor's daily report. His Highness completed Latin translations, theological studies, and mathematical exercises as scheduled. Physical activities included 2 hours of supervised swordplay, horseback riding, and tennis. Unlike his father at similar age, the prince consumed only 2 pheasants and a modest portion of venison at dinner, with minimal wine. No signs of leg ulcers, excessive appetite, or desires to execute household staff have been observed. As our modern understanding of genetics advances, Henry's medical history has attracted renewed interest from researchers studying hereditary conditions, turning the king's messy medical narrative into a historical case study with potential relevance to contemporary healthcare. Genetic researchers have proposed that Henry may have carried Kell-positive blood, which could explain both his reproductive difficulties, particularly the high mortality rate among Catherine of Aragon's pregnancies, and some aspects of his physical decline. Others have suggested McLeod syndrome, a genetic condition affecting the Kell blood group that causes physical and psychological symptoms with progressive onset, potentially explaining both Henry's physical deterioration and his increasing paranoia and mood disturbances. These investigations represent a fascinating intersection of historical research and modern medicine, where centuries-old royal medical mysteries might actually contribute to current understanding of genetic conditions. Imagine the research grant proposal. This interdisciplinary project will analyze historical descriptions of Henry VIII's symptoms using AI-assisted medical text analysis, compare findings with modern genetic disorders affecting metabolism and cognition, and potentially identify hereditary factors relevant to contemporary patients, while simultaneously resolving whether England's most notorious king was simply a jerk or actually had a legitimate medical explanation for beheading multiple wives. The surprising entertainment value of Henry's deterioration emerged during the Victorian era, when historical accuracy cheerfully surrendered to dramatic potential and the king's story underwent significant reimagining. Charles Laughton's portrayal in The Private Life of Henry VIII, 1933, established the chicken-leg-waving, blustering caricature that would dominate popular culture for decades, a character more comically gluttonous than medically catastrophic. This sanitized version of Henry, what we might call Henry Light, continues through most film and television portrayals, including Keith Michel's dashing interpretation and even Jonathan Rhys-Meyers' absurdly svelte version in Showtime's The Tudors, which chose to ignore Henry's physical transformation entirely in favor of continued bodice-ripping potential. Only recently has entertainment begun acknowledging the medical realities, with documentaries featuring prosthetics that recreate Henry's ulcerated legs and mobility limitations. This evolution reflects our changing relationship with depicting disability, from earlier eras when Henry's condition was either ignored or played for laughs to modern approaches that recognize the genuine human struggle beneath the crown. Imagine the Hollywood pitch meeting. So we're thinking Henry VIII, but make him hot the entire time. Yes, I know historically he became morbidly obese with suppurating leg wounds, but our audience demographics show a strong preference for kings with visible abs. We'll acknowledge the historical weight gain by having him mention feeling bloated in episode 7 while still maintaining a physique that could land him on the cover of Men's Health. The pedagogical legacy of Henry's medical decline appears in every school history curriculum that silently transitions from young athletic Henry to older tyrannical Henry, without addressing the medical disaster in between. This educational gap persists partly because discussing chronic wounds, urinary incontinence and purulent infections conflicts with the dignity typically afforded to monarchical narratives, and partly because explaining died from being really unhealthy in multiple compounding ways lacks the dramatic clarity of more straightforward royal deaths like stabbed in the cathedral or lost the battle and the horse. Modern history teachers attempting more comprehensive coverage find themselves navigating the awkward territory between providing accurate medical context and avoiding what essentially becomes a Tudor episode of Dr. Pimple Popper. This educational sanitization isn't limited to Henry. Similar gaps appear around Louis XIV's famous anal fistula and various royal cases of syphilis, creating history where monarchs apparently transition from youth to death without experiencing the messy medical middle that actually drove many of their decisions. Imagine the teacher's dilemma. How do I explain to 30 teenagers that England broke with Rome and thousands died in religious conflict partly because a king with festering leg wounds wasn't thinking clearly and nobody could tell him no? And do I mention the exploding coffin incident before or after lunch period? The economic impact of Henry's medical decline created what economic historians now recognize as one of history's first documented medical-industrial complexes. The royal household accounts show exponentially increasing expenditures for physicians, apothecaries, specialized foods and medical supplies, creating entire supply chains dedicated to supporting one failing body. Merchants specializing in exotic ingredients for treatments enjoyed unprecedented prosperity, while textile suppliers developed lucrative contracts for the constantly needed fresh linens, bandages and specially designed garments. Even the construction industry benefited from continuous palace modifications to accommodate royal mobility challenges. This medical economy extended internationally, with diplomatic channels repurposed to source treatments from across Europe and beyond. Spanish oranges, Ottoman opiates, Venetian glass medical instruments, all flowing toward the black hole of need that was Henry's deteriorating body. In a macabre way, the king's medical disaster stimulated specialized trade and innovation that wouldn't have developed otherwise. Imagine the Tudor businessman's opportunity analysis. Investment in wound ointment production shows 300% growth since last year, specialized chair design has created employment for 17 new craftsmen, and the royal demand for pain management wines has depleted French reserves, opening market opportunities for Portuguese alternatives. If the king's condition maintains current deterioration rates, projected revenue from medical necessities will outpace even dissolution of monastery profits by next quarter. The environmental consequences of Henry's medical care represent a forgotten ecological footnote to Tudor history. The constant need for fresh linens, bandages, and bedding materials accelerated flax cultivation and linen production throughout England, while the disposal of medical waste, contaminated dressings, failed treatment concoctions, and various bodily fluids created what were essentially early biohazard sites around palace grounds. The royal pharmacopoeia's demand for rare botanical ingredients led to targeted harvesting that temporarily threatened certain plant populations, particularly those believed to have wound-healing or pain-relieving properties. Even wildlife felt the impact, as royal hunting expeditions were modified to bring game closer to the increasingly immobile king, effectively creating concentrated hunting zones where animal populations were systematically reduced to accommodate royal limitations. The constantly burning scented candles, incense and aromatic herbs used to mask royal odors consumed resources at unprecedented rates, with palace accounts showing monthly wax consumption equivalent to what smaller households might use in a year. Imagine the Tudor environment impact statement. Current usage of white linen for royal medical purposes requires dedicated operation of 7 additional looms and clearing of 15 acres for flax cultivation. Disposal of used dressings continues by night soil method, though royal physicians recommend burning to prevent theoretical spread of humoral imbalances. Local supplies of rosemary, lavender, and mint have been depleted within 20 miles of primary residences, requiring establishment of dedicated herb gardens at all royal properties and import of aromatic substances from continental sources. The theological reverberations of Henry's physical decline extended far beyond the immediate political consequences of the English Reformation, creating fascinating ripples through religious thought. As the king's body betrayed him despite his status as supreme head of the church, theologians on both sides of the Catholic-Protestant divide found themselves performing interpretive gymnastics. Catholic commentators, carefully and from safe distances, suggested divine punishment for spiritual rebellion, while Protestant supporters developed elaborate explanations for why God would allow his chosen religious reformer to suffer so visibly. These theological debates created new frameworks for understanding suffering and divine will that would influence religious thought for generations. Meanwhile, ordinary believers observed the king's condition and drew their own conclusions about divine favor and royal authority. Henry's insistence on receiving both Protestant and Catholic last rites hedged his spiritual bets in a way that unintentionally emphasized personal choice in religious practice, a concept that would eventually become central to modern approaches to faith. Imagine the Tudor theologian's challenge. We must explain why God's chosen instrument for religious reform is visibly rotting while still alive, without suggesting divine disfavor, personal sin, or the possibility that breaking with Rome was spiritually problematic. Perhaps we could position royal suffering as a Christ-like burden carried for England's spiritual benefit? With appropriate scriptural references and minimal reference to the smell. The gender politics surrounding Henry's decline offer fascinating insights into Tudor-era conceptions of masculinity and power. As the king's body failed to meet period ideals of male vigor, elaborate compensation mechanisms emerged through visual propaganda, exaggerated displays of authority, and strategic exhibitions of what limited physical abilities remained. Court rituals were modified to showcase Henry in positions and contexts that reinforced masculine authority while minimizing physical demands. Seated rather than standing, observing rather than participating, commanding rather than demonstrating. This performance of masculinity despite infirmity influenced how nobility throughout England navigated their own aging processes, creating new patterns for maintaining patriarchal authority despite physical limitations. The king's continued insistence on projecting virility even as his body made actual sexual performance increasingly unlikely created what gender historians recognize as an early example of toxic masculinity's psychological damage, the desperate maintenance of an increasingly fictional self-image at tremendous cost to both self and others. Imagine the Tudor performance review. Your Majesty continues to project appropriate kingly dominance through voice projection, strategic furniture positioning, and executing someone approximately bi-monthly. Recommend continued use of raised platforms during public appearances, maintaining codpiece dimensions regardless of functional relevance, and perhaps fewer references to jousting victories from 2 decades ago during ambassador meetings. The technological innovations spurred by Henry's mobility challenges represent an overlooked chapter in engineering history. The need to move an increasingly immobile monarch between residences, within palaces, and even from bed to chair accelerated development of transportation and lifting technologies that were essentially prototype versions of much later medical equipment. Court engineers designed specialized litters with primitive suspension systems to minimize jostling of painful limbs, created lifting mechanisms using counterweight systems that could raise and lower the royal mass with minimal direct handling, and developed furniture with adaptive features centuries before the term ergonomic entered the lexicon. These innovations emerged from necessity rather than theoretical advancement, but established mechanical principles and approaches that would eventually evolve into modern patient handling equipment. Even seemingly minor developments, like the special utensils created when Henry's swollen hands struggled with standard designs, represented early examples of adaptive technology designed for specific disabilities. Imagine the Tudor engineering brief. Required. System for transporting His Majesty between ground floor and first floor without using stairs, minimizing pain expressions to levels appropriate for public viewing, and maintaining appearance of voluntary movement rather than cargo haulage. System must accommodate minimum 400 pounds, operate silently to maintain dignity, and include emergency release mechanisms in case of structural failure. Previous incident with rope breakage and subsequent execution of responsible engineers should be considered cautionary. The linguistic legacy of Henry's health crisis lives on in modern English expressions and medical terminology that originated in Tudor attempts to describe the unprecedented challenge of the royal condition. Court documents from this period show the first recorded uses of euphemisms that would become standard ways of delicately referring to difficult medical conditions. Terms like royal indisposition, severe illness, temporary discomfort, agonizing pain, and requiring assistance, completely immobile. The need to discuss embarrassing symptoms without explicitly acknowledging royal frailty accelerated development of the English language's remarkable capacity for speaking about medical issues without actually saying anything specific. Even modern medical charting, with its preference for describing symptoms rather than directly naming embarrassing conditions, owes a debt to Tudor courtiers who mastered the art of detailed documentation without explicitly stating that the king had soiled himself again during an audience with the French ambassador. Imagine the Tudor origin stories of common phrases. Under the weather originated when a physician explained Henry couldn't attend a scheduled appearance due to being under the influence of unfavorable atmospheric conditions, rather than hungover and leaking pus from multiple wounds. Feeling out of sorts began as a description of the king's humors being arranged in unconventional sorting, while indisposed allowed courtiers to acknowledge royal absence without specifying exactly which bodily function was currently occupying the royal attention. The philosophical implications of Henry's physical deterioration created fascinating contradictions in Tudor thinking about monarchy, divine right, and the nature of kingship itself. How could a divinely appointed ruler suffer such visible, humiliating physical decline? This question challenged fundamental assumptions about royal authority and its relationship to physical embodiment. Court philosophers and theologians developed increasingly elaborate explanations that separated the concept of the king's body natural, the physical, suffering Henry, from the king's body politic, the eternal, perfect office of kingship, creating theoretical frameworks that would influence political philosophy for centuries. These distinctions became critical as Henry's physical capabilities decreased while his political power remained absolute, forcing conceptual innovation to maintain the fiction of divine perfection despite the evident reality of human decay. Modern political theory still reflects this fundamental division between the person holding office and the office itself, a distinction that originated partly from the need to explain how England's most powerful king could simultaneously be its most physically compromised. Imagine the Tudor philosophical treatise, On the Duality of Royal Embodiment, Reconciling Divine Appointment with Mortal Corruption by Sir Thomas More's distant cousin who was smart enough not to get too close to court politics and therefore kept his head, explaining how a king can be both God's perfect representative on earth and also someone whose leg wounds have developed their own distinct weather patterns. The modern medical relevance of Henry's case extends beyond historical curiosity into practical lessons about patient management, particularly concerning VIP syndrome, the phenomenon where important patients receive worse care due to deference to their status. Henry represents perhaps history's most extreme case of VIP syndrome, where physicians afraid to deliver unwelcome news or enforce necessary lifestyle changes instead enabled behaviors that accelerated his decline. Contemporary medical ethics courses now sometimes include Tudor court medicine as a case study in how power imbalances between patients and providers can compromise care quality. The King's medical history also offers valuable insights into multidisciplinary approaches to complex conditions, showing both the potential benefits of team-based care and the pitfalls of uncoordinated treatment plans. For physicians treating modern patients with similar combinations of obesity, diabetes, vascular insufficiency, and mobility limitations, Henry's case demonstrates with painful clarity how these conditions create mutually reinforcing cycles of deterioration when inadequately managed. Imagine the medical school lecture. Today we'll examine history's most catastrophic example of VIP syndrome and failure of preventative medicine. Consider, if just one physician had successfully encouraged Henry VIII to eat fewer peacocks, maintain regular exercise despite his initial injury, and address the early signs of metabolic syndrome, the entire religious landscape of England might look different today. This case exemplifies why the patient is always right represents dangerous medical practice when the patient is insisting on behaviors that are actively killing them, particularly when that patient can order your execution for delivering unwelcome dietary advice. The surprising nutritional legacy of Henry's decline appears in modern dietary science's understanding of how dramatically food choices impact health outcomes. Henry's deterioration represents one of history's most well-documented cases of lifestyle-induced illness, with detailed records of both his dietary excesses and their physical consequences. Modern nutritionists studying the King's case have identified clear patterns of metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, and inflammation that would be immediately recognizable in contemporary medical practice, but without access to interventions that might have altered his trajectory. The King's diet, extraordinary even by Tudor aristocratic standards, demonstrates with painful clarity the cumulative impact of sustained overconsumption, particularly when combined with decreasing physical activity. What makes Henry's case particularly valuable from a scientific perspective is the controlled nature of the observation. As king, he had unlimited access to the richest foods available, no external constraints on consumption, and a court culture that encouraged rather than limited excess, essentially creating ideal conditions for observing the natural progression of unmanaged metabolic disorders. Imagine the nutritional case conference. Patient presents with documented daily consumption of approximately 5,000 calories, primarily from fatty meats, alcohol, and simple carbohydrates, with minimal fiber or plant nutrients. Physical activity declined significantly following traumatic injury at age 45, while caloric intake maintained or increased. Observed progression from insulin resistance to what appears to be uncontrolled type 2 diabetes with classic complications of peripheral vascular disease, neuropathy, and impaired wound healing. This historical case demonstrates with unfortunate clarity what current bariatric specialists classify as worst-case scenario progression, when metabolic syndrome remains unaddressed. The geopolitical consequences of Henry's health trajectory extend far beyond England's borders, creating ripple effects through European power dynamics that would influence international relations for centuries. As the king's condition deteriorated, England's foreign policy became increasingly erratic, alternating between aggressive posturing and disengaged withdrawal depending on Henry's pain levels, medication status, and ability to focus on diplomatic correspondence. Foreign courts developed specialized intelligence networks focused specifically on monitoring the king's health, recognizing that England's negotiating positions and military readiness fluctuated directly with royal medical status. Spanish, French, and imperial diplomats became amateur medical analysts, carefully documenting physical symptoms observed during audiences and correlating them with policy decisions. This medical intelligence gathering created new dimensions of diplomatic practice that would eventually evolve into more sophisticated monitoring of leadership health as a component of national security analysis. Modern intelligence agencies that maintain detailed health profiles of foreign leaders are essentially practicing a more formalized version of what Tudor ambassadors pioneered out of desperate self-preservation. Imagine the Tudor diplomatic cable. English king received our delegation seated rather than standing, right leg elevated on concealed stool, facial coloring suggesting fever. 3 physicians observed entering royal chambers previous night. Recommend delaying treaty negotiations approximately 1 week when pain levels typically subside based on previous pattern. French ambassador reports similar observations and intends to present territorial demands during next audience, calculating that physical discomfort will reduce English resistance to terms. Recommend counteroffering before French gain advantage through strategic timing of medical deterioration. The archaeological footprint of Henry's medical crisis continues providing valuable research opportunities for historians investigating Tudor healthcare practices. Excavations at Hampton Court and other royal residences have uncovered evidence of specialized waste disposal systems believed to be associated with medical materials, while chemical analysis of certain areas has revealed unusual concentrations of substances used in Tudor treatments. Particularly intriguing are modifications to royal privy systems that appear designed to accommodate a user of exceptional size with mobility limitations, essentially Tudor accessible bathroom design. Archaeological evidence also supports contemporary accounts of specialized kitchen arrangements for preparing the king's medical diets and treatments, including dedicated preparation areas for medicinal foods separated from regular meal production. These physical remains provide tangible connections to the daily management of Henry's condition, offering insights beyond written records that often employed euphemism and discretion when discussing royal bodily functions. For archaeologists, these findings represent a unique opportunity to study how built environments were modified to accommodate disability in an era before standardized accessibility considerations. Imagine the archaeological research paper. Excavation of the southeast section of Hampton Court revealed a previously undocumented chamber adjacent to the royal apartments, containing drainage systems of unusual capacity and evidence of specialized ventilation. Residue analysis indicates high concentrations of substances consistent with wound treatment materials documented in royal apothecary accounts. Spatial configuration suggests a dedicated medical treatment area strategically positioned to minimize the distance the king needed to travel from private chambers while also providing sufficient separation to contain odors and maintain privacy during procedures. Structural modifications to doorways and floor reinforcement in connecting corridors support contemporary accounts of mobility assistance requirements during the king's final years. The artistic representation of Henry's decline reveals fascinating insights into Tudor visual propaganda and the deliberate construction of royal image. Court portraits maintain the fiction of robust kingship even as contemporary accounts describe a man barely able to stand without assistance, creating one of history's most dramatic disconnects between official imagery and physical reality. Art historians studying these representations have identified subtle techniques used by court painters to disguise or minimize signs of illness while maintaining recognizable royal features. Wider stance positioning to suggest stability rather than reveal difficulty balancing, strategic placement of hands to hide swelling, and careful control of facial expression to mask pain. These artistic techniques for depicting power despite physical limitation would influence royal portraiture throughout Europe for generations, establishing conventions for representing monarchy that prioritized symbolic authority over physical accuracy. Modern scholars examining these images with medical knowledge can now identify subtle signs of illness that contemporary viewers might have recognized. Slight facial asymmetry suggesting possible neurological issues, positioning that accommodates mobility limitations while appearing deliberate, and costuming choices that conceal medical realities while projecting strength. Imagine the art history dissertation. Holbein's final portrait of Henry VIII represents a masterclass in political visual messaging, employing strategic compositional choices that transform medical accommodation into displays of dominance. The king's wide stance, rather than revealing stability issues, creates an impression of territorial occupation. Swollen features are reinterpreted as signs of prosperity and strength, while clothing volumes that accommodate medical realities simultaneously evoke expansiveness and authority. This deliberate transformation of potential weakness into visual power established representational strategies that would influence political portraiture well into the modern era. The psychological impact of managing a deteriorating king created fascinating patterns of collective coping mechanisms throughout the Tudor court that offer insights into organizational behavior under extreme stress. Court records reveal increasingly elaborate systems for managing, predicting, and surviving royal mood swings, essentially creating one of history's earliest documented workplace mental health accommodation plans, albeit designed to protect courtiers from the patient rather than support the patient himself. These adaptations included carefully timed presentation of information, coordinated with medication schedules, strategic deployment of distractions when difficult news needed to be processed, and development of specialized communication approaches for different phases of the king's pain cycles. Modern organizational psychologists studying these historical patterns have identified remarkable similarities to contemporary approaches for managing volatile leadership, suggesting that certain institutional responses to powerful but unstable authority figures remain consistent across centuries. The psychological toll on those forced to constantly navigate this unpredictable environment created documented patterns of stress-related illness among courtiers, with some contemporary accounts describing physical symptoms we would now recognize as anxiety disorders, insomnia, and hypertension. Imagine the Tudor Workplace Wellness Report. Current court conditions demonstrate critical stress indicators among 73% of surveyed Privy Council members. Recommended interventions include rotating exposure to royal presence to prevent burnout, establishing clear warning signals for dangerous volatility periods, and implementing mandatory recovery periods following particularly intense royal interactions. Concerning trend of increased alcohol consumption as coping mechanism noted among gentlemen of the bedchamber, particularly those assigned to wound care rotation. Immediate intervention recommended for Lord Hertford, who has developed visible facial tic when word France mentioned in royal presence. The surprising public health relevance of Henry's case extends into modern approaches to pandemic management, particularly regarding quarantine and containment protocols for infectious disease. While not understood in microbial terms at the time, Tudor records describe remarkably sophisticated isolation procedures developed to prevent the spread of whatever might be causing the king's wounds to putrefy, essentially creating early infection control protocols based on observation rather than germ theory. Court physicians, noting that those with extended exposure to royal wound care sometimes developed similar symptoms, implemented handler rotation systems, specialized cleaning procedures, and basic protective equipment in the form of herb-filled masks and vinegar-soaked cloths. These practices, while based on miasma theory rather than microbiology, nonetheless established procedural frameworks that would eventually evolve into modern infection control. Particularly noteworthy were the information management systems developed to track which staff had exposure to which royal symptoms, creating a prototype contact tracing system centuries before such approaches became standardized. Imagine the Tudor Infection Control Manual. Persons attending His Majesty's leg dressing shall approach no food preparation areas for minimum 3 hours following exposure. Linens and bandages removed from royal person must be submerged in vinegar solution before removal from chambers. Rotation of wound care personnel shall be maintained at intervals not exceeding 3 days to prevent transmission of noxious vapors. Camphor pouches must be worn by all within 3 yards of exposed royal wounds. Any servant developing signs of suppuration or unusual odor must report immediately to the groom of the stool for reassignment to duties outside royal proximity. The complex legacy of Henry's relationship with pain management offers fascinating parallels to modern opioid challenges, particularly regarding the impact of chronic pain on decision-making and personality. Tudor records describe increasingly potent pain remedies prepared for the king, including imported opium preparations that would have created patterns of dependence and withdrawal recognizable to modern addiction medicine. Contemporary accounts of Henry's behavioral swings, from near comatose sedation to explosive irritability, correlate remarkably well with what we now understand as medication cycling effects. Particularly noteworthy for medical historians are the detailed descriptions of tolerance development, with court physicians constantly seeking stronger preparations as previous formulations lost effectiveness, essentially documenting the same patterns that drive modern prescription escalation concerns. The impact of this medicated fog on English governance during crucial years of religious reformation and international conflict raises fascinating questions about how chronic pain and its treatment have shaped historical events beyond this single case. For modern pain management specialists, Henry represents an instructive extreme example of how untreated underlying conditions can create pain management challenges that ultimately become more debilitating than the original injury. Imagine the addiction medicine case study. Patient demonstrates classic progression from injury-related pain to medication dependence complicated by psychological factors including positional authority preventing effective intervention. Initial pain management with alcohol and available herbal preparations progressed to imported opium tinctures with documented tolerance development requiring continual dose escalation. Behavior patterns show characteristic cycling between sedation and hyperirritability consistent with opioid fluctuation, while decision-making capacity shows progressive impairment particularly regarding risk assessment and impulse control. Contributing factors include enabling behavior from caregivers who fear consequences of imposing limitations, continuous access to controlled substances without oversight, and absence of comprehensive treatment addressing underlying causative conditions. The enduring cultural fascination with Henry's physical decline reflects our collective ambivalence about powerful figures confronting the ultimately undefeatable opponent of their own mortality. The king who reshaped religion to suit his marital needs, who bent parliament, pope, and foreign powers to his will, found himself ultimately defeated not by any human adversary but by the simple biological reality of a body in revolt. This narrative of unchecked power meeting immutable natural limits continues resonating through literature, film, and political commentary precisely because it captures a universal truth about human experience, that regardless of wealth, power, or determination, physical decline eventually comes for us all. Modern political figures facing health challenges are still evaluated through frameworks established by Henry's example, with public fascination focusing on the contrast between power projection and physical limitation. This enduring cultural template reveals our ongoing negotiation with mortality itself, particularly our complicated relationship with powerful individuals who embody both extraordinary authority and ordinary human frailty. Imagine the cultural studies analysis. The persistent reimagining of Henry VIII's decline across centuries of artistic interpretation reveals society's continuing need to process the fundamental contradiction between human power and biological limitation. From Shakespeare's oblique references to Victorian moral cautionary tales, modernist psychological explorations to contemporary medical documentaries, each generation reframes Henry's body as a canvas for their own anxieties about mortality, particularly how we reconcile the inevitable physical diminishment of even the most seemingly invulnerable authorities. This cultural processing reflects not merely historical interest but ongoing collective negotiation with the democratic reality of physical decline, the one truly universal human experience that affects kings and commoners with equal inevitability, if not equal resources for temporarily delaying its progress. As we reflect on the bizarre case of Henry VIII, the king who literally rotted alive while maintaining absolute power, what emerges isn't merely a historical curiosity but a profound meditation on the human condition itself. The fundamental disconnect between Henry's decaying physical reality and his undiminished authority creates a powerful metaphor for our own complicated relationship with bodily limitation. His story resonates across centuries precisely because it captures universal experiences in extreme form: the shock of physical betrayal when our bodies fail to match our self-image, the desperate search for medical solutions when conventional approaches fail, and the psychological gymnastics we perform to maintain identity despite physical transformation. Whether viewing Henry through medical, political, psychological, or philosophical lenses, his case ultimately reflects back our own mortality, just with better costumes and more dramatic consequences. Perhaps the most ironic aspect of Henry's legacy is that a king obsessed with dynastic continuation, who broke with Rome and remarried repeatedly in pursuit of male heirs, ultimately made his most enduring mark on history not through his children but through his own spectacular physical decline, creating a royal medical case study that continues fascinating us nearly 5 centuries later. The ultimate lesson? Even absolute power has absolutely no power over biology, a humbling reminder that whether you're a Tudor king or modern reader, the body always has the final word. If Henry VIII's decomposing corpse could somehow rise from its undersized tomb at Windsor, breaking through yet another floor in the process, he'd likely be horrified by his modern legacy as history's most famous medical disaster. The king who spent astronomical sums on creating an image of virile majesty now features prominently in medical textbooks as exhibit of 4 untreated diabetes, VIP syndrome, and what happens when you combine unlimited power with unlimited calories. While he imagined future generations would remember him for religious reformation, military conquests, and an impressive dynasty, we're instead fascinated by his festering leg ulcers, expanding waistline, and the psychological deterioration that accompanied his physical collapse. It's like planning your legacy as a sophisticated intellectual only to discover people mainly remember you as that guy who got his head stuck in a bucket that one time at the office party. Henry's story offers the ultimate historical reality check, a reminder that no matter how powerful you become, your body keeps the final scorecard. Modern medicine views Henry's case with a combination of scientific curiosity and wincing sympathy, recognizing in his symptoms the unmistakable progression of conditions we now routinely treat. Endocrinologists see classic signs of uncontrolled diabetes leading to peripheral vascular disease. Orthopedic specialists recognize how his 1536 jousting accident created the perfect storm of reduced mobility, weight gain, and wound healing issues. Psychiatric professionals note the textbook progression from chronic pain to personality changes, impulsivity, and paranoia. Yet perhaps the most valuable medical lesson from Henry's case isn't about specific diagnoses but about the danger of untreated comorbidities, how multiple health problems create vicious cycles of deterioration when each condition worsens the others. Henry essentially experienced the consequences of modern lifestyle diseases without access to modern interventions, creating a medical perfect storm that played out with excruciating slowness over a decade. Imagine showing Henry's case to medical students today, and this, future doctors, is why we recommend diet and exercise changes immediately rather than waiting until your patient requires a small village just to change positions in bed. What's particularly fascinating about Henry's deterioration is how it transformed from personal medical disaster to political force, reshaping English governance, religious practices, and ultimately the national character itself. The increasingly erratic leadership of a king oscillating between pain-induced rage and medication-induced confusion accelerated development of administrative systems designed to function despite rather than because of royal input. The need to manage an unpredictable monarch essentially created institutional resilience through necessity. Government officials became adept at interpreting, redirecting, and occasionally completely reinterpreting royal commands to maintain functional governance. These adaptations established bureaucratic patterns that would long outlive Henry himself, creating an English governmental tradition that prioritized institutional stability over individual leadership whims. It's rather like discovering that your company's most efficient operating procedures were originally developed to work around a particularly difficult CEO. The dysfunctional leader unintentionally forcing creation of functional systems designed to minimize their own impact. Perhaps the most relevant contemporary parallel to Henry's situation comes from modern discussions about leadership health transparency, particularly regarding aging politicians and executives who show signs of cognitive or physical decline while maintaining positions of extraordinary power. Henry's court developed elaborate systems for concealing, managing, and working around royal limitations, creating precedents for institutional handling of leadership incapacity that continue influencing governance today. The careful information management surrounding his condition, the strategic scheduling of appearances during periods of relative lucidity, and the development of decision-making processes that maintain the appearance of direct leadership while accommodating actual limitations. All these approaches remain recognizable in modern political operations. When we debate how much voters should know about presidential health, or question whether corporate boards adequately monitor CEO capacity, we're essentially continuing conversations that began in whispers around Henry's sickbed. The fundamental question remains unchanged across 5 centuries. How do we balance privacy, dignity, and authority against the public's legitimate interest in leadership capacity? What ultimately makes Henry's story so compelling isn't just the grotesque medical details or political consequences, but the profound human tragedy beneath the crown. A man whose body betrayed him while his power remained absolute, creating perhaps history's most extreme case of trapped consciousness. Imagine experiencing your physical capabilities deteriorating day by day while maintaining complete authority over one of Europe's most powerful nations. No one could force lifestyle changes that might have helped. No one could insist on more effective treatments. No one could even suggest that perhaps declaring war while experiencing medication side effects might be reconsidered. Henry essentially became imprisoned in his own decomposing body, with unlimited power over everything except the one thing that mattered most: his own physical decline. This psychological horror story beneath the surface of Tudor political history offers a profound meditation on the limitations of power itself. Henry could order executions, launch armadas, and create entirely new religious denominations, but he couldn't command his own cells to heal or his own tissues to regenerate. There's something almost Greek in this tragedy, a powerful figure undone not by external enemies but by the inevitable limitations of human biology. The intimate connection between Henry's physical condition and England's religious reformation offers a fascinating case study in how bodily realities shape apparently abstract theological decisions. While history often presents the break with Rome as primarily motivated by Henry's desire to annul his first marriage, the timing of his most radical religious actions correlates suspiciously well with his physical deterioration. As pain increased, tolerance for opposition decreased. As mobility declined, the need to control his environment, including the spiritual realm, intensified. Theological historians now recognize that many of Henry's most extreme religious decisions occurred during periods of documented medical crisis, suggesting that England's Protestant identity owes as much to infected royal leg wounds as to genuine theological conviction. This perspective doesn't diminish the Reformation's importance but rather humanizes it, reminding us that even history's most consequential spiritual transformations emerge from the embodied experiences of fallible humans making decisions influenced by their physical conditions. The cathedral you worship in today might exist because someone important had a really bad day with their chronic pain 500 years ago, a reminder that divine inspiration sometimes arrives through decidedly unglamorous earthly vessels. For feminist historians, Henry's physical decline offers valuable insights into the experiences of his final wives, particularly Catherine Parr, who essentially served as royal nurse companion during his most difficult years. Contemporary accounts describe Catherine reading to the king during painful medical procedures, managing his increasingly volatile moods, and navigating the dangerous territory between wifely obedience and self-preservation. These descriptions reveal patterns of caregiving labor, emotional management, and strategic relationship navigation that remain recognizable in modern healthcare contexts. Catherine's success in surviving marriage to Henry during his most physically and psychologically challenging period represents a masterclass in what we would now call emotional intelligence. The ability to support without enabling, to manage without challenging, and to maintain personal boundaries while appearing to have none. Her carefully calibrated performance of devoted care while simultaneously advancing her own religious agenda and protecting her physical safety demonstrates skills that caregivers of difficult patients still develop today, suggesting that certain aspects of the caregiver experience transcend historical context. The strategies Catherine developed for managing an irritable, pain-ridden, absurdly powerful patient would be immediately recognizable to any modern nurse assigned to a particularly difficult VIP hospital room. The architectural modifications made to accommodate Henry's changing body created lasting innovations in English royal residences, demonstrating how disability, even unacknowledged disability, shapes physical environments. Hampton Court's famous wide doorways, gently sloping approaches and ground floor expansion all originated from the practical necessity of moving an increasingly immobile monarch through spaces originally designed for more typical bodies. These adaptations, initially created for one specific user, established new standards for royal architecture that would influence palace design long after the original reason was forgotten. This pattern, specific accessibility needs driving broader design innovation, appears repeatedly through architectural history, from curb cuts originally designed for wheelchair users that now benefit everyone from parents with strollers to delivery workers with carts, to voice-activated technology developed for disabled users that evolved into conveniences everyone now takes for granted. Henry's specific bodily requirements unintentionally pioneered more accessible royal spaces, creating precedents that would gradually influence broader architectural standards. It's a pattern that continues today, where accommodations initially designed for specific disabilities often evolve into features that improve usability for everyone, a process disability activists call universal design. The remarkable contrast between Henry's actual physical condition and its artistic representation offers fascinating insights into historical image management that remain relevant to modern media analysis. Court painters tasked with portraying a physically declining king while maintaining appropriate royal dignity essentially pioneered techniques that modern Photoshop experts, public relations specialists, and political image consultants would recognize immediately. The strategic use of posture to suggest strength rather than accommodate weakness, careful selection of angles that minimize unflattering features, and use of clothing to disguise rather than reveal physical realities, all these approaches created visual propaganda that deliberately contradicted physical evidence available to direct observers. This disconnect between representation and reality creates valuable perspective on our own media environment, where carefully constructed images of public figures often contrast dramatically with first-hand accounts of their appearance or behavior. Henry's portrait legacy reminds us that image manipulation didn't begin with digital technology but has always been an essential component of power projection, particularly when physical realities threaten to undermine authority narratives. The king's carefully managed visual identity, maintained even as his actual body betrayed him, established techniques for representing power despite physical limitation that continue influencing political imagery across centuries. The complex relationship between Henry's declining health and England's international position demonstrates how leadership's physical condition shapes national security in ways that remain relevant to modern geopolitical analysis. Foreign diplomats stationed at the English court became amateur medical analysts, carefully documenting symptoms observed during audiences and correlating them with policy fluctuations. Their dispatches, reporting on everything from the king's coloring to his ability to concentrate during negotiations, created a form of intelligence gathering focused specifically on leadership health as a component of national power assessment. This medical intelligence directly influenced diplomatic strategies, with foreign powers timing difficult negotiations to coincide with periods of royal physical distress when resistance was likely to be weakened. These Tudor-era practices established precedents for modern intelligence operations that similarly monitor leadership health as a critical component of national security analysis. Contemporary concerns about aging world leaders, questions about cognitive decline in positions of authority, and strategic timing of international confrontations based on leadership health assessments all continue approaches pioneered by diplomats attempting to navigate Henry's increasingly unpredictable court. The fundamental insight, that a nation's effective power projection depends partly on leadership physical and mental capacity, remains as relevant in today's situation rooms as it was in 16th-century privy councils. For modern workplace psychologists, the Tudor court's adaptation to Henry's condition offers a fascinating case study in organizational response to toxic leadership, showing how institutions develop coping mechanisms when direct confrontation proves impossible. Court records reveal increasingly sophisticated systems for managing, predicting, and surviving royal volatility, strategic timing of information delivery to coincide with medication cycles, careful monitoring of facial cues to detect mood shifts, and development of communication approaches specifically designed for different phases of pain and medication effects. These adaptations, created by courtiers whose literal survival depended on accurately navigating the king's condition without acknowledging its existence, demonstrate organizational resilience under extreme stress. Contemporary workplace researchers studying similar patterns in modern institutions, though typically with lower execution risks, recognize in Tudor court behavior the same adaptive mechanisms that emerge around volatile leaders today. Information filtering to avoid triggering reactions, strategic timing of difficult conversations, and development of early warning systems for mood fluctuations. The psychological impact of serving under unpredictably volatile authority, whether royal or corporate, creates remarkably consistent organizational behaviors across centuries, suggesting that certain aspects of human response to power remain unchanged despite vastly different contexts. So what can we learn from the bizarre case of Henry VIII, the king who rotted alive while maintaining absolute power? Perhaps the most relevant lesson isn't medical, political, or even historical, but philosophical, a powerful reminder of the ultimate democracy of physical decline. No matter your wealth, power, or status, your body remains the final authority on your actual capabilities, a reality as true for modern billionaires and world leaders as it was for Tudor kings. Henry's story continues fascinating us precisely because it captures in extreme form this universal human experience. The shock of physical betrayal when our bodies fail to match our self-image, the desperate search for effective interventions when conventional approaches fail, and the psychological adjustments required to maintain identity despite physical transformation. His case reminds us that even history's most powerful individuals ultimately face the same biological limitations as everyone else, just with better furniture and more people pretending not to notice the smell. In an era of anti-aging technologies, life extension research, and transhumanist aspirations, Henry's decomposing body offers a humbling historical reality check. A reminder that mortality eventually comes for kings and commoners alike, with remarkable indifference to crowns, wealth, or protestations of divine right. So the next time you feel your knees creak while climbing stairs or notice your metabolism isn't what it once was, take comfort in this. At least you're not simultaneously trying to run a country, maintain 6 marriages, and establish a new religion while your body turns against you. Henry's grotesque medical journey may have changed the course of Western civilization, but your aging process will likely be considerably less consequential, and with modern healthcare, significantly less malodorous. Perhaps that's the final irony of this most ironic royal tale. The king who broke with Rome, beheaded opponents, and rewrote England's religious landscape to ensure his immortal legacy ultimately achieved it not through the son he so desperately sought but through his spectacular physical deterioration. Henry VIII, the king who wanted to be remembered for creating a dynasty but instead became history's most famous medical disaster. Sometimes, despite our best efforts to control the narrative, our bodies write the final chapter.